Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about bargaining, bad behaviour, and butchery. But to tell it, I'm afraid I need your help. And I'm going to ask you to put on a pair of dancing shoes and enter through the doors of the Sheraton Hotel in Addis Ababa. From there, I ask you to join me at a place I'm really embarrassed to say I know rather well, the Gaslight Discotheque, Ethiopia's most exclusive nightclub. Well, you may be hoping for Armin van Buren. Beware, you're in for a really nasty surprise. This is what you might find. This is another night on the dance floor of the Gaslight Discotheque. In the midst of acute violence in South Sudan, here you see the government and rebels signing the first of 8 ceasefires agreed and broken in 18 months. There are several ways of continuing the story from here, and one of them is this, that there is a great deal of deliberation and signing of agreements that didn't quite work, and time spent back in the pool and the tea room, and a bit more deliberation in the development of what, in technical political science terms, we call a budding bromance between belligerents. But of course, the other way to tell the story is this, is whilst the peacemaking and pool parties proceeded, on the ground, the South Sudanese suffered. This presents the paradox that drives me to speak to you this evening. Peace processes have toxic reputations. Indeed, some scholars argue that peace processes lead to worse violence than if they'd never happened. Just to illustrate this, look at this red box. It presents statistics that suggest that the average number of fatalities are much higher for civil wars that end in negotiated settlements compared to civil wars that end in military victories. And the same scholar, Monica Toft, has also produced quite robust evidence that civil wars are much more likely to recur after negotiated settlements compared to military victories, and also that those civil wars are roughly 50% more deadly than the civil wars that recur after military victory. Now, the curious thing is that mediators know this, but modern civil wars produce peace processes with rare exceptions, whether it's Colombia or Syria or any other context. So why do mediators keep turning up? And more to the point, how can they do a better job? Well, the simple answer to the first question is that peace processes are politics. And those politics shift violence from one theatre to another, from the city to the village, from brothers to sisters, from the battlefield to the bush. Now, to drive this home to you, what I want to do is show you 3 totally fascinating things about the data on violence in civil wars. And the first thing I want to show you is that data that we usually use is on elites. That's men with Rolexes doing deals far from the battlefield. But we all know that we don't necessarily need men with Rolexes to make peace. What about really local level, community-driven, inclusive peace processes like this? This is the 1999 Wunlit peace process in South Sudan, which was highly community-led, led by chiefs, very inclusive. Pretty much everyone signed on, and you can see that in the bottom right-hand photograph where people are signing the agreement with their thumbs. The second feature of the data that I wanted to show you is that the data are on fatalities. But there are so many types of violence that don't kill people. What about the people who don't actually die? What about the orphaned? What about the displaced? We need to include these people in our data, and more to the point, we need to understand their experiences of violence. This leads me to a third issue, which is really, really fascinating in my view, and that's that it's actually completely common sense that violence should rise after peace agreements. And to help you think about this, I want you to consider how civil wars actually happen. So what tends to happen is a civil war starts, and there's a huge escalation in violence, and a bit of volatility, and then if we're lucky, it drops away. Now, peace negotiations tend to start after that peak, and peace agreements tend to get signed down here, when violence has dropped away. Now, that moment of signing a peace agreement, which at the very least is a security pact, is a moment of political instability because things need to be enforced on the ground. And so we tend to see in the immediate run a rise in violence. After that, anything can happen, maybe a bit of volatility. If we're really lucky, it drops away, but that's not inevitable. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is the shape up here is exactly what the data does for violence in Darfur around the Darfur peace process and in the former Sudan around the 2005 Sudanese Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Now, this graph seems to indicate that violence is shifting, but what it doesn't show is how the purpose of violence shifts or how who is experiencing that violence shifts. Now, that's actually really important for us to understand. Consider again contemporary South Sudan. Last August, the belligerents signed another peace agreement. Now, sadly, that agreement, from the data that we've got, led to a rise in civilian deaths. And one reading of why that was is that it basically saved the lives of soldiers and generals, whilst allowing them to re-strategize and fight each other indirectly through starving each other's populations. So where does this bleak picture leave us, and what can we do? Well, maybe there are situations where elite peace negotiations simply shouldn't be done. I mean, why not stop here? But I'm not advocating for an extremist solution. I'm not saying that at least peace negotiations should never happen. What I am saying is that mediators need to be more savvy about when elite peace negotiations have become a charade and a mere sideshow to violence escalating on the ground. In these situations, mediators can either complement or replace elite peace negotiations with a number of things. One of them is, of course, local, community-led peace processes, like WNLIT, that I showed you before, which have actually been shown to be highly successful at reducing micro-level violence. The other thing that mediators can do is move to shuttle diplomacy. And what that is that means mediators going to the context, going to conflict contexts, and engaging belligerents in those theatres, and maybe acting as a messenger between people fighting each other and building trust progressively on the ground. Now, that may sound all rather dangerous and a bit tricky, but in fact, it can be quite straightforward. It can be a bit like this. This is in fact me last July conducting a shuttle diplomacy activity in South Sudan. I'm not on a battlefield, but I'm actually extremely close to a battlefield. I'm just behind the front lines on the rebel side. And maybe just a bit of trivia for you all. Can anyone guess what that stick construction is in the background? An absolutely massive weapons cache. Piled up to the roof were plywood boxes full of quite massive machinery and ammunition. My research looks at when mediation can make a difference and when it can't. I look at the value of written agreements, and I also look at the impacts of the activities that surround and package written agreements. I also look at situations where perhaps donors should say, we're not going to fund this. We're not going to aid and abet bad behavior on the dance floor of a luxury hotel in order to get people to sign a piece of paper. This leaves us still with an important puzzle. Why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep making peace in a way that the evidence says is silly? Well, if you really want to know, come back in 5 years and read my PhD thesis. Thank you.